Uh, there's a whole. I had 3 channels to work in my day, and
ABC,
now
CBS, NBC.
3 places. One of them here.
Yes.
But
For decades, fans have believed that Happy Days ended rather too quietly in the 70s, arousing suspicions. But insiders know there is more to the story, and their leaks would leave you speechless. Happy Days ranks at the top of Hollywood's biggest 70s hit list, from its satirical portrayal to just flat-out slapstick humor. However, rumors of a scene continue to persist as the reason for ending the show. Could one scene really have caused this sudden wreck? Is there more than the producers told the fans? Join us as we uncover the scene that wrecked Happy Days, a golden era with a hidden shadow. Nostalgia can be a serious opiate for most people, especially those born in the 70s. However, who could blame a man longing for the 70s when television shows like Happy Days set the tone in Hollywood? However, it isn't all sunshine and rainbows like most nostalgic old heads would have you believe, especially behind the scenes of one of their best show to have been on television at the time. But why exactly do many seem to find it impossible to get out of Happy Days? One quick look through the internet might immediately reaffirm the saying that old truly is gold. When you take into account some of the characters on the series, including Richie Cunningham, who put a smile on everyone's faces, and his closest friend, Fonzie, the mechanic lad and leather jacket-wearing menace, who rented out the Cunninghams' garage. Both of these lads were the stars of the show, and they really turned on the charm. However, following 11 seasons of success, the show ended. And according to sources close to the directors and producers of the series, the show did not just come to an end, suggesting that it was deliberately brought to a halt by some of the most powerful shadow figures, deeply lodged at the base of the Hollywood skull for reason yet to be disclosed. While nostalgia does have a way of sanding down the roughest edges of history's blade, the collided egos and words said behind the scenes were always bound to leave a mark. And now the rumors fly yet again about a conspiracy, a failed scene that set the tone for the decisions that forced the show to come to an end. For decades, the rumors continuously changed their forms, with unverified sources reporting unproduced scenes that led to some strife between the actors, and a well-hidden beef between Ron Howard, who played Richie Cunningham, Henry Winkler, who played Fonzie, and other directors of the series, as they tussled for power over creative control. Ron Howard's character Richie had started as the main star of the show, but as the series progressed, Winkler suddenly became top billing, playing Fonzie like no one else in the world could have done. And it was no exaggeration as the facts stood tangibly between Ron Howard and his dreams to be top billing, as was originally planned before fans fell head over heels for good old Fonzie. Although both actors have verified no such news, watching the series unfold and Fonzie taking the spotlight that was obviously meant for the loving son of the Cunninghams gave way too much legs for the rumors to stand on, breeding more questions than answers. But if the shifting wind of fame really created the tension, what other turmoil was brewing behind the scenes? The Fonzie phenomenon and the shift in power. The Hollywood business has always been infinitely cutthroat. It is a game of viewership, streams, and income for the producers. However, getting these views was absolutely reliant not just on the script, but on the application of the actors who brought these scripts to life. Ron Howard was absolutely fantastic as Richie Cunningham, lighting up black and white television with his smile and supreme acting skills as the son of Howard and Marion Cunningham. His guile and representation of what it meant to be a part of a family set the tone for the 1970s pop culture. He was grounded yet ambitious and in awe of his parents. He was the poster child for 70s kids who focused on making friends, championing mischief, and punching above their weight without the fear of getting embarrassed in a society where trying and failing is an acceptable form of growth, as long as you keep trying. The very first episodes of the show were focused rather heavily on Richie Cunningham, Patsy Weber, and Ralph Malph. It was the regular hero of a movie, introducing friends to the fans. However, Fonzie at the time was only a secondary character. However, this was not because he wasn't deemed a good actor, but the scriptwriters and director just never really saw the need to give Fonzie a super prominent character. The story was built for Richie and the Cunningham family, and the network did quite a job to keep them in the spotlight and have fans feeding right off their palms. However, it wasn't long before a few writers and directors noticed a change. At first, it was a slight reaction. Hence, it did not get as much attention as it could have, but soon the changes could not be ignored. It was almost obvious to the blind that the cheer and reaction from the fans were louder and different when Fonzie was playing major roles on the series. And it did not even matter if he was playing right alongside Richie Cunningham, or if he was just going solo and enjoying being the high school dropout and promiscuous mechanic. At this point, Fonzie had become inevitable, and his attention was suddenly being needed on screen more than it used to be. Imagine being created as a beta, only to be so good that you then had the right and trust of the creators to be on the same level as the alpha. This sudden shift was profitable for both parties, but it favored Fonzie even more. Not only was he going to get more screen time, but he was also going to be going home with more money. But that wasn't all he could get. An improved deal for his recent constant appearance on the show meant that he could actually challenge the scriptwriters and try to influence their decisions, the way they wanted to tell their story. In the past, that was a Richie-dominated domain, but the times had changed, and Fonzie was no longer the lad who stayed in Cunningham's garage. But just how soon did the ABC network start to capitalize on Fonzie being a fan favorite? And how did it impact his relationship with Richie? A BC cash cow. Happy Days came to life in the golden era of Hollywood. Hence, it was no surprise the level of dedication put into the craft. However, as much as dedication mattered to every director and scriptwriter, what mattered the most has always been about making money. The series has been crafted, but just how can it yield more money? That has always been the mantra in Hollywood. Hence, when Fonzie's sudden rise to fame came around, it did not take the network that long to have him in overdrive, churning out cash after cash from viewership and merchandise. The scriptwriters immediately wrote Fonzie into being a very important member of the Cunningham family. Maybe not by blood or name, but most definitely by his association with their kid, Richie. By season 3 of Happy Days, Fonzie, alongside Richie, was a top-billed actor, and somehow he had become oxygen to the life force of the series. Sources close to both actors tell tales of their bromance continuing for a while, even after they had been put on the same pedestal by the network. But the elephant in the room was right there, and no one wanted to address it. Was Ron Howard really happy to have his spotlights suddenly being shared by what appears to be a potential usurper? Other actors behind the scenes watched both actors daily, carefully avoiding being in each other's path, but were in a silent feud that no one could really prove. Insiders believe that Ron Howard, after some months of processing the need to share his spotlight with Gold Old Winkler, met up with the top dogs in Hollywood, including executives from the ABC network, asking that his spotlight be returned, and Fonzie could simply just find a new spotlight for himself. To Ron, that was a viable idea, especially since he wasn't asking for an upgrade, and he was only asking that things go back as they were. However, in Hollywood, the money comes first, and since Fonzie is leading the franchise alongside Richie, they made way more than they used to. Hence, why would they slaughter their cash cow for meat and dried blood when they could drain it for milk for much longer? Ron Howard could tell that his spell on the screen was getting short-circuited by Fonzie's explosion to fame, but somehow he was still so revered on the show. However, a new path had started to call to him, so he considered the responsibility to focus on working behind the camera rather than being in front of it. But to capitalize more on Fonzie's fame, ABC wanted even more from Fonzie, with the cast and crew working hard to make it a reality. But what could happen if this means they drive a scene too far? A BC's hidden hand, steering the Happy Days machine. The Happy Day franchise did not start as a super big television series that had everyone on the edge of their seats and expectant. At the time, several television series were just starting to grab the attention of 70s America. However, Gary Marshall had an idea burning inside of him, but he was unsure if it would be successful. He could only know by trying. So, he set up a wonderful story about a Midwestern United States family, the Cunninghams. Then he partnered with the ABC network in 1972, using their anthology show, Love, American Style, as a conduit to promote the unsold pilot of what would become Happy Days. The success was impossible to hide, so ABC Network, trying to beat other television networks to the punch, struck a deal with Gary and eventually became the sponsoring network for the whole series. Consequently, this means that the ABC has been the driving force for this well-oiled machine, taking a risk on it when no one else would. Although Gary retained his role as creator of the show, the ABC network provided funding and presented the series on its network. Although Gary was the man at the top of the creative fulcrum, giving his blessings before every script was fleshed out on screen, at least so it seemed, insiders close to Gary described the ABC as a controlling whisper in Gary's ears, telling him whom to promote and who needed to take a back seat. However, these sources believed that the network's level of control did not move any further than reshuffling backroom members of staff, which included the man on the lights, the makeup crew, or the janitor crew. But Fonzie's rise to explosive fame only meant one thing: there's blood in the water, and the sharks will start to circle. It was a time when hijacks were common, and a whole new network could simply poach Fonzie from them, taking him off their hands with promises of making him a star. While that might be good for Fonzie, and maybe help keep the peace on the set of Happy Days, it would be extremely bad for business should they lose such talent to another broadcasting network. But in Hollywood, a place where the most ruthless show business bosses come to play unfairly, whatever happens, the show must go on. But here is the kicker. The show does not run on oxygen or fossil fuels. The show runs on money, hence, they cannot afford to lose a single cent. Already, the network had given Fonzie the spotlight without a care in the world about what Ron Howard might be feeling. It's dog-eat-dog business. A network of their size cannot afford to be the little dog. They have to come with the bark and the bite, regardless of whose heads needed to be bitten clean off. And this time, it was Ron Howard's. It is safe to say that Gary did have a good thing going on with the cast and crew members on the set of Happy Days, but according to insiders, he was now being coerced into making a change so drastic that it could rip the whole fabric of the show apart. Sources close to the situation believed that he had been strong-armed by Hollywood forces stronger than him, and he now had to make a choice, which in this case was to take a stand against the decision, or just go ahead with it and take whatever answers he got. But how would Gary live with himself if he ever made that conscious decision to speak to Fonzie and Richie and pitch the ideas to them under his own name? How would Richie react to it? Ron Howard's fall from grace. The day of reckoning was here, and somebody had to decide to speak to Ron Howard, Richie, and Henry Winkler, Fonzie, about a change in their positions in the franchise. For some context, Ron Howard from the very first season of the show had over 75% of the plot built around him, while Fonzie shared somewhat equal screen time and coverage with the other cast members of the show. For Ron, there would never be a sweeter deal than being the face of a sitcom franchise that gigantic. It's a position that came with fame, respect, power, and, more importantly, ego. And this time, his ego was about to be bruised. Already he had been asked to share the spotlight with Winkler, but he, creator of the show, seemed to be asking for more. Insider sources claim that directors had started to reject scripts that featured too much Richie Cunningham, as his presence on the set as the lead character was not giving the same energy from the fans as having Winkler there as Fonzie. Call sheets that survived that era reflected that Ron Howard was only ever called in on set to film a part of Season 3 for approximately only about 25% of the filming exercise, meaning that he no longer shared the spotlight with the Winkler. He was effectively being written out of the story as a minor character, and his perspective was dying out right in front of his eyes. Objectively, Fonzie, who has been written into stardom, was the perfect man for the show. He had the charisma, the nuance, and the know-how of being a bit of a jerk who had some conscience if you had the time to search deeply enough. This was no longer his series, it was now Fonzie's, and he knew it. He had been tasted, chewed, and spat out by the same system that built him. Sources close to him state that he wallowed in self-pity for some time, but he was the type to take the good with the bad, even though it somewhat appeared that he had not been given enough chances to prove himself. And Hollywood, just like a train that never waits at the station, always has to move on, and so did he. Hence, he kept up appearances like a good lad, and he showed up when needed, taking his bit part roles. However, as much as he kept the raging storm in and found ways to keep himself from falling apart, as that might ruin his opportunity with potential suitors, Ron was still broken, so he made a conscious decision like an adult to simply keep going to the sets and get the job done. His character had been toned down since the 3rd season of the show, but he waited all the way down to the 7th season to simply quit being humiliated by the franchise. But why did he wait that long? He had all the opportunity to refuse being on the same set as a minor, where he was once considered a top dog. But something else happened. This time, it wasn't just about getting his character watered down and nearly irrelevant. It was something much darker and different shades of sinister. What could the franchise possibly have asked of him? Fonzie's Happy Days.
We have 5 grandchildren.
Okay. What's
we
the
have
youngest?
2 girls. The youngest is 10 months old.
10 months old. Okay, so you got, and so have
And
these
the
kids...
oldest is 8. India is 8.
8 years old. That's perfect. That's Happy Days age.
Following Ron's fall from grace as the leading character of the show, which he had taken considerably well, the network wanted more than a surrender from him. They wanted Fonzie to not only be the face of the franchise, but also bear its name. Imagine rejoining a firm with a guy who was your junior, and before you could say ho ho ho, his name is now on the company's front door, almost like a partner. Such was Ron Howard's case in the 70s. But things get more shrouded in mysticism, as Ron could barely tell if the idea came from Gary or someone further up the food chain than he is. Ron wondered what apex predator would still want to take something from an already wounded prey. He had already lost his importance to the network, but this new decision to change the franchise's name just seemed like an overkill on his fragile heart. However, Ron, a man already defeated by his own industry, did not fight the decision. Instead, he walked up to Gary for a chat and asked what he would be naming the franchise should he still choose to rename it. For him, it was important that he at least got a semblance of closure if renaming the franchise meant that he would be completely cut off from the series. In his chat with Gary, his response had him crashing out. Gary had told him that he would be renaming the franchise as Fonzie's Happy Days. To Ron, that was going to be nothing else than the final straw, and he was more than willing to take the leave and just go anywhere else but on that set. In August 2025, Ron Howard said in an interview that it made perfect sense that Gary and the network would build this Fonzie character and maximize that, especially if it's your cash cow. But the optics of now being in a show called Fonzie's Happy Days, my ego wouldn't allow for that, he said. At this point, it was no longer about a job or survival for him. For Ron, it was about keeping his legacy intact. Although Fonzie's eccentric, larger-than-life character created a niche for him that suited the time and had him climb up the ladder so quickly, Ron, also, is not some half-baked actor. He literally murdered his role as Richie Cunningham. But sometimes the world changes and the atmosphere shifts, and suddenly, no one really wants anything to do with you anymore. However, as much as he saw logic as an important part of Gary's reasons, his sentimental attachment to the movie and the set could only mean one thing. Ron was not pleased by the idea of Winkler playing an eponymous character, as it completely shuts down his impotence as one of the few who started the show, and also his ego would not allow him to watch another man take over his office as the top-billed actor. Gary Marshall knew Ron too well to assume that he was bluffing. He knew that he would leave the franchise, just like he said, if the movie was ever renamed with Fonzie as an eponymous character. Fonzie had already stolen his thunder, but renaming the franchise after him will be stealing the last shred of dignity that he had left. At the time, he did not have the most solid contract. Hence, if Gary had decided to simply take the step, there was absolutely nothing that he could have done about it. However, Gary chose to let him keep his dignity. Fonzie had become the golden boy, but more was required of him to really push his star power. But how did they ever set up the most outrageous demands to push Happy Days even further? And what consequences did that ambition bring them? Jump the Shark, the scene that changed everything. The Happy Days franchise had always been about setting the standard for doing some really daredevil actions. But whatever happened, family was always at the tip of the spear, leading the charge. However, during the shooting for Season 5, Episode 3, the invisible hands of the network were there yet again, steering the Happy Days machine and demanding something rather outrageous. Think about it. Everyone loved the sitcom, but it was 1977 when chest-thumping action movies were being displayed on television, including The Gauntlet, The Car, Star Wars, which was driving 70s kids insane, especially with the lightsaber swords, The Baron, and more. Although the genre was different from the sitcom, crossing paths was not the worst idea in the world, especially since Sir Harry Winkler was deemed flexible enough to take on these roles and show up at the table of some of the best action stars in the world and not seem like a misfit, especially since his aesthetic was just as fitting, black leather jacket, mechanic, and bit of a rugged demeanor that could actually sell this new daring action-packed scenes on the Jumping the Shark episode. At first, most fans considered Jumping the Shark as a metaphor, which probably had some dramatic implications, and was going to be a real saying owing to its unnatural neology, and also being part of a sitcom like Happy Days. But so little did they know that they were in for a rude awakening. While anyone sees an action movie with the expectation of seriously violent punchlines and a hero with a square jaw and Aristotelian characteristics, the expectations, every time that a 70s kid turned the TV on to see Fonzie in action, were completely different. Hence, why change that? Insiders report that the scene was rather quite disturbing for some of the crew members as Gary Marshall introduced this new phenomenon. Scriptwriters dragged their feet, directors rejected multiple rewritten scripts, and even Fonzie walked around the set barefoot. All very little actions, but they were absolutely disturbing for Gary, who needed to make sure that the scenes were brought to life. This silent rebellion dampened the energy around the set and caused just that little bit of friction between Gary and other members of the show. However, they soon found their way back and got the job done. For Henry Winkler, it was not that much of a hassle, as he was already great at skiing. He had the legendary leather jacket on and hopped on set, looking like the same old serious self, trying to create a scene that would be in the memories of everyone forever, and set the tone for an avant-garde action explosion in a sitcom. While Winkler looked at the scripts with his friend Danny Most, he was really upset, looking at what his show had devolved into. This was a shot at cultural change, but it seemed to be coming at a time too early, and Winkler just couldn't wrap it around his head. Ron was on set too, still playing a bit-part role in the franchise, but he watched as Fonzie was taking the series to a whole new level, especially with this daredevil action added to it. On the set, they had created the perfect conditions to have Fonzie shine. The producer took shots of the scene at Paradise Cove, Malibu, California, looking to create a sense of realism. Fonzie did all the skiing himself, except for the part where he jumped the mechanical shark fin, which was performed by a stunt double. And right there and there, the noise around had started to lose its voice. How damning were the consequences of these unexpected scenes? Business as usual. Following the Jumping the Shark episode, the tabloids were surprised at just how far the network was willing to go to stay relevant. It seemed to most of the 70s kids as a poor attempt to exhaust a Hollywood franchise with disappointing sequels. While it seemed at the time that their world was going to come crashing down and their reputation was lost in tabloid hell, getting grilled by every reporter and critic out there, the network and Gary Marshall strived to come up with something a bit more in the classic form of the sitcom that America had come to like. They could tell that the avant-garde decision had brought more trouble than they bargained for to their doorstep, and now the time had come for a revival. Resuscitating a dying series was not a new concept in Hollywood. In fact, it was simply business as usual. But getting the next episodes right, making the Jumping the Shark just seem like a shot in the dark, and a moment of madness was no mean feat. Yet they made it work. But for how long? The situation was precarious, but also rather volatile to touch. There were way too many angles. It could drive an expert at feng shui crazy. Sources claimed that scriptwriters came to Gary and the network, telling them that the short skyrocketing of the viewership on that stunt was always going to die out when fans start to chase the high of such actions, but also had to sit through a story about family values. Finally, the network was convinced that they had screwed the pooch, and they really needed to find ways to rebuild their reputation and remind the fans why they fell in love with the Cunningham's in the first place. Gary, being the voice of reason, spoke to the scriptwriters and directors. According to an insider behind the scenes, he repeated the same monotonous speech that he had given when the series had first started and begged them to help salvage the show. And somehow, it worked like a charm. Everyone was pulling in the same direction and looking to get the familiar sitcom mode back in place. Although Fonzie had been written to be that spontaneous guy who just lived life as it came, Jumping the Shark was a little bit too risky, even for him. So they toned down his love for the wild, wild actions, kept him a bit grounded and measured, and also strengthened Richie Cunningham's emotional arc. The ratings were once again stabilized, and business was booming again. However, speaking or Richie, riding the bench while watching Fonzie be the star, forced him to find a way out of the show. Hence, he forced the scriptwriters to write his character out and put him up for service in the Army, while he focused on his dream to be a director. Although the charm was back, and Happy Days was back as the 70s favorite sitcom, it did not last very long. Now, did it? Happy Days are gone. While fans of most Hollywood franchises have been rumored to have goldfish memory, forgetting every poor little thing that might have marred the franchise at some point, fans of Happy Days have a rather long memory. And for some reason, even while the scriptwriters tried to salvage the damage caused by the Jumping the Bridge episode, it remained a stick to beat the franchise with. The series lasted for 11 whole seasons, losing its light on July 19, 1984. However, before the series came to an end, it had birthed several spin-offs, including Laverne and Shirley and Mork and Mindy, making sure that somehow the series continues to breathe. Unfortunately, the main series did not survive the constant revisionism, and fans consistently backed to the Jumping the Shark episode. The write-ups continued to praise the show for its charm in the 70s and how much of a net positive it has been on pop culture, especially with the 2011 comment by political commentator Rush Limbaugh to say on his radio show, who blew back at Michelle Bachmann's HPV vaccine claims with the unforgettable line, "She might have blown it today." Well, not blown it, she might have jumped the shark today. Although the official reason has been declining ratings and top cast members departing from the series, insiders, with a scoop on what really happened, believe that the show never recovered from the jumping the shark scene, and the shadows of that infamous stunt continued to haunt the show until it was taken off the air. Do you think avoiding the jumping the shark scene could have saved the franchise and kept it running for much longer? Is it possible that the show was already doomed immediately the network took that risk? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.